Hi, welcome to this week's podcast. My name is Pastor Jake Mullen. I'm the lead pastor at Home Church, and we are going to have a great podcast today with Eunice Danielson. She is our overseeing pastor for Euro-Asia. She's been part of our church for 45 years, and she has been on the mission field for 31 years. And honestly, Beck and I talk about it all the time, how she's one of the living heroes of the faith. And I know she wouldn't even want to hear me say that, but that's really the way that we think about her. And she's lived in China, she's lived in Kazakhstan, she's lived in Turkey, where she lives now. And we're going to talk about her story and find out what motivates her and drives her to keep going on the mission field. And so, Eunice, we're so glad to have you here today.
Well, it's awesome to be here.
Yeah, we're excited. Eunice, just tell me how you got on the mission field. What is your story?
Well, I was a young girl, and I came to the church when I was actually 16 years old and started just being part of Home Church, actually in Wetaskiwin, and then the church moved to Ponoka, and I was part of the initial launch there in Ponoka many years ago, and just serving in the church. And one day, Pastor Mel said, we're going to send 2 teams this summer to the mission field, one to Mexico and one to Taiwan. Amazing. And I said, I want to go to Mexico. I have no interest in Asia. I want to go to Mexico. And then for some reason, the Mexico team got canceled, and I said, I'm not going. And I was sitting in church one Sunday, and I just felt like God said, you're supposed to go on that Taiwan team. And so the next day I went to my boss. I had just started a new job, and I asked for 2.5 months off. Wow. And he said yes.
Unbelievable.
And then God provided the money. And in 1982, I went on my first mission trip to Taiwan.
Wow.
And then from there, God just led step by step by step. I went back and lived in Taiwan for 6 months, and then God spoke to me about China. 1988, I moved to China and served there 5 years.
Can you speak some Mandarin for us just for a moment?
你好吗？你怎么样？我很好。
So when you went there, you obviously had to learn the language?
Yeah, I learned Chinese, and I spoke it quite fluently back then. Yeah, and just, in China, of course, I was there as an English teacher. Everything was underground. In those days, things were pretty primitive. I've got lots of fun stories. But we baptized people in bathtubs. In my 5 years there, I think I saw 40 people baptized in bathtubs.
Amazing.
And would do small groups, in our homes in different places, and just it was all, somebody would knock at the door and you'd quickly hide the Bibles and everything. And
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And was it a certain people group that you were working with, or just...
Yeah, it was an unreached people group. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
That's so cool. And so you've told the story before of even going to our founding pastor.
Yes.
And, just telling him what was on your heart. Can you tell a little bit of that story?
Well, after I came back from Taiwan, I just had China on my heart. I knew that I was called to China. And so I would go and knock on his office door and say, Pastor Mel, please send me to China. And he's like, well, you're going to go by yourself. And
sure,
let's just...
you were how old at that age?
Oh, in my early 20s.
Right. So those are probably pretty normal questions to
exactly.
ask. I'm sure for your parents too.
Yeah. My parents, I was an only child.
Wow.
But they had dedicated me to the Lord before I was born. So they were always supportive. But
Amazing.
And so, I just waited. And, I remember those, it was probably, it was a couple years actually. And I just kept wanting to go, and it just wasn't the right time, and I was just frustrated, but I just waited for the blessing from my local church. And when I went, I know it was God's timing, and I was sent out from the church, and that has made really the whole difference in all of these years.
Amazing.
Yeah.
How did you went to China, and then when did you leave China?
And then after 5 years, in 93, I felt the call to move to Kazakhstan, former Soviet Union. Had just broken up, and revival had actually started. You
Wow.
know, there was freedom to preach the gospel. And so I moved there and I started working with a Russian-speaking church, but I was reaching out to another Muslim minority people group there as well. And so actually I spent 13 years there.
Wow.
And
did you have to learn Russian as well?
I learned Russian, yes.
Yep.
And now my Russian is my best foreign language.
Really? Can you speak something in Russian?
Здравствуйте. Я очень рада быть здесь сегодня.
What she just said is, I wish you'd stop asking me to speak in other languages. It's very awkward. I'm a great translator.
Well, not exactly.
Anyone that can speak Russian is laughing right now as we do this. But amazing. And I know I'm going off topic a bit, but like, how long did it take you to learn these languages? And what was the process of that?
Well, a couple years to be able to, speak like
Fluently.
normally. I wouldn't say fluently because I still have an accent. But yeah, and then just practice.
Right.
Yeah. I tend to learn languages by practicing, by speaking. And so I did take classes, but then I just practiced with people.
So what did you do while you were in Kazakhstan?
Well, I started working with a Russian-speaking church, and in the early 90s, there was real revival after communism fell in the whole former Soviet Union. And so this church had grown, like in 2 years, to 1,000 people. But my heart was for a Muslim minority people group that was there. And so I started working with them.
Yep.
And at that time, there were only about 4 believers in all of Kazakhstan.
Wow.
And so we started working in the different villages and areas and eventually established an ethnic church under the covering of the larger Russian-speaking church.
Wow.
And after 5 years, I was able to hand that over to my spiritual son,
Right.
who was one of those 4 that was a believer when I first came there, him, his mom, and his
Amazing.
grandma. And then I had a heart for further training for the people because people were getting saved in those days, young people, and they just had a heart for evangelism, for planting churches, and they'd go to Bible school for 1 year and then they'd be sent out somewhere to plant a church.
Right.
And so I felt that if we were going to send them cross-culturally to other countries, they needed more training.
Right.
So we started a second year for the Bible College.
Yep.
It was called the Missions Training School, and I directed that for 5 years.
Very cool.
And out of that school, we sent nationals from Central Asia to about 10 different nations.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so how did you end up going from there to Turkey?
Well, then in the last year or so of my time in Kazakhstan, I was just feeling this unsettledness that there was a change coming. And I couldn't really put my finger on it. And I had talked with Pastor Mel and Heather, and they felt the same thing, but none of us really knew what the change was. And one day I was with Pastor Heather, your mother, in Florida at a conference, and we were having lunch together. And in that lunch conversation, God just dropped Istanbul.
Wow.
And by the end of the lunch, I knew I was moving to Istanbul.
Amazing.
Yeah. And so started to make plans to move to Turkey. And then I remembered that about 2 years prior to that, I had been in Istanbul for a meeting, and I'd been in a taxi, and I felt like God said to me, you're going to live here one day,
Wow.
and there's going to be a missions training center.
Amazing.
And I thought, wow, that's awesome. And then I kind of forgot about it. I thought I
Sure.
probably just made that up.
Yeah.
And so I'd put it on the back burner, but then I remembered. And so I moved to Istanbul in 2006. And it's really kind of funny because I moved there with 3 women. So there were 4 of us, women, moving to this Muslim country with a big vision. I always say God has a sense of humor.
Sure it is.
And just didn't really know anyone there, but just moved there in faith and believing that someday we would have a strong hub church, a center, and that we would train people for the nations.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And that's where you are now.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
amazing things have happened since you've been there.
Yeah. 13 years. You know, sometimes you think it's going to happen a lot faster than it actually does. But we, at the time that I moved to Istanbul, Pastor Mel was still the lead pastor here, and
Right.
he had gotten the vision for one church.
Right.
And so when I moved to Istanbul, we planted, well, it was Word of Life then, but
Sure.
home church.
Yep.
And so right from the beginning, we were home church in Istanbul. And we rented a facility for 10 years.
Yep.
It was in the basement, and we just started building a church.
Yep.
And the interesting thing was that because we were Russian speaking, I had moved there with a heart to reach Turks, and I
Right.
still have a heart to reach
Yep.
Turks. But at the beginning, I felt like God just gave us kind of a bridge to the Turks, and that was
Right.
through Russian speaking people. And he started to bring people from all over the Russian speaking world, and many of them got saved, and many of them had contacts with Turkish people,
Yeah.
or some women married to Turkish people. And
Yeah.
so that was the beginning of how we started and built a church. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Now we have facilities there.
Yeah. And so the vision for a center, in my mind, it was always that it would be a building.
Right.
And so a few years back, we started looking for buildings.
Yep.
And, we had no money.
Yep.
And
Literally no.
literally no money. And, in Istanbul, buildings aren't cheap.
Yeah.
And
It's a big city. How many people are in Istanbul?
Istanbul, 16 to 20 million people.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And so went and looked at different buildings, and I remember I would walk into offices with these CEOs of companies to negotiate about prices about buildings as if I had $1 million in my pocket,
Right.
when I really didn't know where the money was going to come
Yeah.
from. And then we found this place. It's 2 floors.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that this building was built exactly the same time I moved to Turkey with this
Oh, wow.
vision, but it had sat vacant for 10 years,
Wow.
waiting for the right time for us. And these 2 floors had never been developed.
Wow.
And so we negotiated on this building. And, they kept calling saying, well, when are you going to finalize? And I was like, well, we're waiting to hear from our investors. And,
Right.
God knows where those investors were. And then God did
That's
a
right.
miracle
Wow.
and provided the funds. And we were able to buy the building. And then it's been a process to finish it
Sure.
and renovate it and get it ready. But we've completed a whole floor now, and it's very exciting.
And you just need
Yeah.
a bit more money to
Yeah,
finish
exactly. Exactly. We just need to finish now the top floor.
it. Right? Fantastic.
Yeah.
So cool. Tell me a little bit about Turkey. I've heard it's one of the most unreached places
It is. It
in
is.
the world.
The population of Turkey is about 80 million people, and there are only about 6 to 7,000 believers
Wow.
in Turkey. Yeah.
Just for the listeners right now, as you're listening to that, I just want that to sink in a little bit.
Yeah.
80 million people,
people. And-
6,000 believers.
Well-
What a job that we have to do
Yeah.
in Turkey, and really we need everyone's prayer.
Absolutely.
We need
Absolutely.
if you're watching this and you go, man, I'd like to give to that. Well, there's always the opportunity to do that, but also to pray,
Yeah.
because there's so many people who need Christ.
And the thing is that Turkey, next to Israel, has the most historical biblical sites. The early church was birthed
Yeah.
in Turkey.
Tell us a little bit about that.
The 7 churches in Revelation are in Turkey. Ephesus is in Turkey. Antioch, where Paul left from on his first missionary journey,
Yep.
is in Turkey. And so, there's such a rich history of the church in Turkey. And I believe that God wants to restore
Yeah.
Christianity to Turkey.
And reclaim it. So many
Absolutely.
buildings there
Yeah.
that were
Yeah.
originally Christian
Yeah.
heritage.
Yeah.
Wow, so amazing. I know as well that they're in that area of the world, that whole region, because you're in charge of everything home church in Euro-Asia.
Right.
What is Euro-Asia? Just give a picture.
The whole Silk Road region, really,
Okay.
and then reaching into some of the Eastern European countries. We also have a home church in the Ukraine, for example.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And so in that whole area, there's a lot of persecution.
In many of the countries, there is, and so I have had friends, pastors, who have spent time in prison.
Wow.
And even some to this day are still in prison for their faith.
Wow. Amazing to think about that, as a Canadian or American Western, we haven't had to deal with true persecution. Yeah. And, I've heard things like that. Some of them, I don't know if they're really absolutely true, but, there's been more people persecuted for their faith in the last 10 years than this or that or whatever. But the reality is that there are a lot of persecuted believers around the world right now. It's
going on right now. And in many of those countries, it's sometimes even illegal to own a Bible,
right,
or to meet in church meetings. So, it all takes place underground.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why one of those things, even as a Canadian, I think, the prayer that is part of our national anthem, God keep our land glorious and free.
Yeah.
And every time I pray that and sing that, I sing it as a prayer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we're so blessed to live in a country where we can freely worship God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing. So you're in Turkey. What does church look like there? Like I know that it's a home church. It's got a home church DNA, but I also know it's got its own culture that you're reaching, and also just the way people live is a little bit different. Tell us about what that looks like.
Well, one of our 5 values at home church is engaging the culture. And so, when we go into a different country, we have to engage the culture that's there in order to reach people, to build bridges into their culture, to share the gospel. And so, we try to do that in every country where we work. So in Turkey, of course, we have our home church DNA. And when you walk into our church building, it feels like home church.
Wonderful.
We've got, the logo and the different things, but
the friendliness of people.
And, but
same worship culture and those type of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. But, we in Asia, for example, there's such a hospitality, and so after the service,
and
we
food
always
is such an important thing.
Food and having time together. So after the service, we always have like lunch together, and that's a big part of our culture there. And just so that people come in and they feel welcomed, and we try to include them and that they feel like they're becoming part of our family.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. Oftentimes I talk about. I think it's a negative thing in Canada. I call it the garage mentality. It's so cold here. You drive into your garage, you come out of your garage. You don't see your neighbors from like October to, Easter.
Right.
Till April, and because it's so cold, you're in and out, and there isn't the same hospitality. One thing I love about being with people from other countries is they have an ability through food and a table to just connect better and develop great relationships, and that's a real gift and a blessing.
Yeah, it's really
rich.
Important in our part of the world. Yeah.
And so after a service, you guys often have lunch together.
Yeah,
right?
Every Sunday we have something. Sometimes more of a light lunch, sometimes a bigger lunch when we have like what we call a big Sunday.
Okay, yeah.
And people hang around.
Right.
Yeah, they hang around for the afternoon and just start connecting with each other, and
Yeah, wonderful. I just wanted to say, Eunice, thank you for being such a great example of faithfulness. To think that 31 years you've been on the mission field, 45 years part of this church with the same pastors. You've just kept yourself connected from across the world. Some people have a hard time being connected across the street. Tell me like some of the things that have been important for your longevity in ministry, but also just your longevity and connection into the vision and the church.
Well, I believe one key to any success that I've had is that I have been connected to my local church. And the anointing that comes down, the counsel, the support, just knowing that my church is with me has really been a key, I believe. But, how do I keep that? Well, I believe it's a decision. First of all, it's a decision that I decided a long time ago that home church is my church, and Pastor Mel and Heather are my pastors. They still are. Now you are also my pastor. But I decided, and so I have done everything that I can do to keep that connection. And sometimes when you're far away, you can feel a bit isolated. You can feel like, maybe they don't really get what's going on over here. This is a different culture. But I have decided that these are the leaders that God has put in my life. And what I found over and over is that God speaks to Pastor Mel and Heather. God speaks to you. And even if maybe you haven't lived in this culture, but there's a wisdom that comes down. There's a word from God that has directed my path. And so, it's a loyalty. I've decided to be loyal, a commitment, and it's a decision. Yeah.
And it's relationship as well.
Absolutely. It's not just like a pyramid, but it's a strong relationship. And
you've pursued that.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
And how do you think you've pursued that? Like, is it just getting in as close as you can when you can? What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's, like sometimes I have to take the initiative, instead of, sometimes, I talk to friends over on the mission field and whatever, my pastor never calls me or whatever. Well, okay. I feel like it's up to me, that I take the initiative, I communicate, and, often, it comes, the other way, but it's a decision that I've made. And so, when I'm able to be in Canada, or when teams come over, then I try to spend as much time and to be accountable. That's a very important part of it. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
What does the future look like for you, Eunice? What does the future of Istanbul and that whole region of the world look like? What are you the most excited about?
Well, I'm very excited that. My heart is that we're gonna train many people, and we're going to launch home church into many, many more nations, other cities in Turkey. We already have 3 locations in Turkey. And
how many other locations would there be in that area of the world?
Basically 3 or 4 apart from Turkey at this point. But there are some that are up and coming as well that I'm working with relationships. And so that's my heart, is that we're gonna grow and expand, and as the vision of our church is everyone needs Jesus, everyone needs a home, and that's my heart, is that everyone in that part of the world needs Jesus, and it doesn't matter their nationality, and so we want to share that good news, and we want to build a place that's a home for those people in many of those nations.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So one more very important question. So is in Turkey, do they speak Turkish?
Yeah.
So do you speak Turkish?
I speak Turkish, not as well as Russian or Chinese.
Can you speak something in Turkish for me?
Nasılsınız? Benim.
Whatever she said. Sounds great. Eunice, thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. We're just praying God's best for you. If anyone wants to be involved in anything happening in Turkey, maybe you want to give towards it, you can always contact us at the church. Come in and see us, ask us how you can be a part. We'd love to see how people can be a part of the vision, whether that's through giving. Maybe there's someone that would go, man, I want to go on a mission trip. You can talk to us on a Sunday, or come into the office and speak to someone. Eunice is usually on the other side of the world. We're glad you're here for this week, for summer camp and this week, but we're just praying God's best for our home church there and for you. And thank you so much for all that you're doing around the world to see Jesus connect with people that are far from him at this point, but we're believing for great things ahead. I want to say thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you would subscribe that would be wonderful, because we're going to have great podcasts every week along with the regular sermon that comes from our church every week. Subscribe. And also, if you really enjoyed it, would you post it on Facebook? We'd love to get the word out that this is going on. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was a blessing to you today. Have a great day.